What's the coolest thing you can say about one of your ancestors? My great-grandmother was the very first woman they allowed into medical school in Hong Kong. It was back in the day. She was a doctor. My grandfather, her son, became a surgeon. My uncle, his son, is a surgeon. Unfortunately, the 3-generation streak for becoming a doctor has been broken by me, my siblings and cousins. None of us have come close to wanting to become doctors. Sorry, die poor. An ancestor of mine fought in and was injured in the Civil War. Years later he died in an accident during a reenactment of the battle he was injured in. That's some Final Destination type crap right there. My cousin was Preacher Rowe, all-star pitcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers. The coolest thing I can say is that on the 12th of October, 1949 he threw a complete game shutout against the New York Yankees in the World Series, the only game Brooklyn won against New York in that series. Rowe's mother was a sister to my great-granddad. When Rowe pitched in the World Series, it was a really big deal for my family. They got to travel to New York for the game. My great-grandmother rode on the team bus across town. Rowe played with Jackie Robinson and many other Dodger greats from that time period. I met him a few times growing up, mostly at funerals unfortunately, but he did come to my house for a day and visit with me and my dad. He loved to talk baseball, but he also knew a lot about the family. The house my parents live in was built by my great-great-grandfather, so that was Rowe's grandfather, and he spent a lot of time there as a kid. He passed a few years back, but he lived quite a life. My great-great-granddad was a boxer who fought 245 times. He once had 2 fights in one day. In one instance, he finished work at Billingsgate Fish Market in London, took the train up to Liverpool, fought about, had his purse and clothes stolen, and still made it back in time for work the next day. He was killed in the Somme in 1916. I'll give you that, it was some story. My grandfather grew up in the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan, and got drafted for World War II. He became a POW in a German camp pretty quickly and was there until the war ended, around a year later. At that point, Stalin was executing the POWs because they didn't escape or die trying. He and several others took the name of some dead Turkish soldiers who were previously POWs at the time. This allowed him to get sent back to Turkey rather than his home country. He never saw his parents again, and he didn't see other members of his family for several decades. I also have a Turkish last name, but I have no Turkish ancestry. My great-great, maybe one more, grandfather fled Germany after breaking into a food reserve during a famine. The local government would not hand out food, so he fed the people in the town with the help of his sister and some friends. After that, they fled Germany and never saw each other again. There is a street named after him in the town he was from, and the event is documented there. I should never forget that for every group of idiots on this planet, there are at least a few great people that don't get the attention they deserve. Your grandfather and his sister sound like really good people. My grandfather, my father's name family, was shipwrecked off of Newfoundland, on his way to Delaware. As an orphan he stayed there. We did not find this out until we were living in Delaware, 86. And my uncle on my mother's side did the family tree. On our street at the time were 3 families with the same last name. I originally thought you were stuttering. The first family to arrive in this area from Europe was a single mother raising 6 kids. The father got off the boat and it left without him. Instead of being sad, the mother stepped up and settled near Lancaster and thrived. All 6 kids survived too. As a 14-year-old Polish Jew in 1939, my great-grandfather had every reason to flee the Nazis as they swept into Łódź. His family fled east, only to be immediately captured by the Soviets. His father was involved in some sort of altercation with the Soviets, so they executed the father and sent my great-grandfather to a work camp in the Caucasus while the rest of the family were deported to Siberia. A year later, my great-grandfather, along with other prisoners, escaped from the work camp to Turkey on a makeshift raft. He somehow made his way to Ellis Island, NY as an immigrant. When he turned 18, he joined the US Army's 99th Infantry Division. He took part in the Battle of the Bulge and the liberation of Dachau concentration camp. Since he spoke Yiddish, Polish, German, and English, he was able to interview many of the concentration camp victims and testify during the Nuremberg trials. According to Ancestry.com, one of my ancestors lived to the age of 150, one had 15 children before his death at the age of 2, and one achieved the notable featuring of dying 8 years before he was born. I think Ancestry.com is full of crap. Dying 8 years before he was born. Talk about being bad at life. I had a great grandpa who used to beat the ever-loving crap out of his son. One day, when the son is a grown man and leaves to marry, have kids etc., he came back, tied the great grandpa to a willow tree and beat him nearly to death with a chain. Vengeance. You got those vengeance genes. One of mine was a whaler in the 1800s, and one of the first white men to settle in our region. He was also one of the only Europeans to enter Ka'apoipa before it was sacked by Te Rauparaha, and married the daughter of a Maori chief, potentially for trading purposes, before leaving her for a white girl as the story goes. Before he leave you but for a white girl, till Kanye West was a whaler in the 1800s. My ancestor was in line to inherit an enormous Irish estate that was, at one time, essentially the whole of County Kerry. That all fell apart because they fell in love with a Protestant, eventually eloping to America, leaving behind a life of enormous privilege and inherited wealth in favor of one of love. The family attempted to track them down, ordering her to be brought back and him to be killed. They never found them, though. My direct tree descends from a child they had whilst still in Ireland, who eventually came to England. I also have mystery relatives in the USA somewhere, via children they had later on after eloping for their lives. TLDR, if not for a story of forbidden love, I'd probably be Irish and rich. The way these things go, more likely scenario is you not existing. My grandmother went to high school with Janis Joplin. My grandma died when I was really young, so I never actually got the chance to ask her about this. It was just a family story. Looked it up just now to make sure my family wasn't totally full of it, and yep, found a reunion page that lists deceased classmates and my grandmother's photo is there alone with Janis Joplin's. My dad apparently smoked a joint with Janis Joplin when he was in high school and she was a bit older. Before she got huge he was with a couple of buddies and they had mutual friends. He said he never liked her. My great-grandmother outlived 2 husbands and survived technically both world wars. Born in 1917, she passed away this year weeks after becoming 100 years old. My grandmother was the same way, but only one husband who died in 1970. She lived from 1970 to 2017 as a widow. She just died this year. My ancestors on my father's side were blacksmiths. It may not be the coolest thing in the world, but I find it freaking awesome. If they were in the future, they'd probably be calibrating guns. Piece of land was promised to 2 families, one of them mine. When it was brought to the attention of the king, he decried that the first family to get to the land could claim it. Fastest way was by boat. We were losing. One of my family members chopped off his hand and threw it to shore. We were the first and claimed the land. My grandfather beat the pee out of a cop while his innards were falling out of his stomach because my grandma was speeding and he wouldn't let them go so he could get to a hospital. Dude was tough. Survived several heart attacks, strokes, 30+ surgeries, 2 different cancers, the Korean War, getting blasted by a grenade, but brain cancer finally did him in. Great grandpa was an at the time famous baseball player for minor league and eventually MLB. He was a pitcher and struck out Babe Ruth. I now have a baby who can hurl a pacifier 15 feet at 10 months old. Also, I can trace my lineage back to the original British settlers of England, America. They were Quakers if I recall correctly. Original British settlers of England. I'm assuming you forgot to add new before England P. While all my maternal great-grandparents were stuck in the concentration camps, both paternal great-grandfathers were American soldiers who were simultaneously working to liberate them. They didn't know it, but about 50 years later their grandkids met at Brooklyn College, got married and gave birth to me. My family has traced 10 convicts sent from England to Horse back to the early mid-1800s. On the other hand, my so is related to Blackbeard apparently. Being related to Blackbeard is a pretty cool claim to be able to make. One great-granddad was a Romanian trapeze artist in the 1920s, who eventually acted alongside Alec Guinness and settled in London, where he had a successful stage show with his wife and NBSP. Other great-granddad joined the Red Army in World War II at 17, made it from the far east of Siberia all the way to Prague, got minorly blown up, which left him rather deafened with a dicky leg, came home and happily lived to 85, and NBSP. He also became awesome friends with other great-granddad, who spent World War II in a camp, since he was of German descent but lived in the USSR. Minorly blown up. Not necessarily an ancestor, but my great-grandfather, one of Canada's oldest living Mounties, retired and became a fireman for a few years. One day he was on a riding lawnmower cutting his friend's grass while they were out of town. Well, he got too close to the edge of a hill and it rolled on top of him, maiming his leg beyond repair. My great-granddad tied his belt around his leg to slow the bleeding, dragged himself back up the hill and called 911. When the paramedics arrived, he was on the porch with a beer and a smoke wondering what the heck took them so long. The first time I can recall meeting him was in the old folks home he resided in. My brother and I were screwing around with his fake leg when our dad caught us and started telling us off. My great-granddaddy grabs the leg out of my dad's hands and starts kicking him in the butt with it, yelling "You don't fuckn yell at my grandkids like that." My great-grandfather was a bad butt, and I hope I can be half the man he was someday. You've got a couple legs to lose then. I am part of the Hatfield bloodline. My great-great-great uncle is Jesse James the American Outlaw, and my great-great-grandfather is from Moscow and had a wooden peg leg but is not special at all beyond that. So if you're asking who would win in a fight, I think it would be the Russian because they are the scariest kind of white people. Sounds like you're the real McCoy. If you go back to the early 1700s, one of my ancestors was a Royal Navy sailor who later became a pirate and died in the Caribbean. My great-great-granduncles were Orville and Wilbur Wright. They were the brothers of my grandma's grandma, or something like that. I'd have to dig out my grandpa's genealogy book to tell you exactly. Someone else in this thread mentioned the Wright brothers. Go on, find your long-lost relative. My ancestors had tickets to the Titanic, but they were running late and missed the ship. My grandma still has the tickets somewhere. My grandma still has the tickets somewhere. Those would be awesome to bring to Antiques Roadshow. My great-grandmother was a Russian Jew. When she married my Italian Catholic great-grandfather and namesake, her family sat shiva because she was dead to them. That is kinda sad. All of them had sex with the proper people and at the proper times to eventually lead me to living. And because of that, I'll be alive when Infinity War comes out. Don't get ahead of yourself now. One branch of my family was a semi-famous cannibal gang near Chicago. One of my mom's ancestors was best friends with one of my dad's ancestors, who became a POW in the Civil War, and his best friend came to testify for him on trial. That's all I've got. My great-great-grandmother was a college-educated woman who divorced her husband and moved to the US from Lithuania with her children, where she was successful and happy. Being a divorced, educated Jewish immigrant must have been extremely tough for people to accept, but she freaking nailed it. Mad props to her. One of my ancestors was part of the very first colonists that moved to Canada. I am the 13th generation from the non. We have a book that has the names of most, if not all, of the colonists' names. My family name is in there, and one of my uncles has a family tree that all the way back to this guy. Never saw it myself, but I have the book. Hello Mr. Tremblay. My great uncle was a paratrooper on D-Day, then was a construction worker on the CN Tower in Toronto. Near the end of the project he became the first person to base jump off of it. It was a successful jump but he got fired. Airborne all the way. One of my fairly distant cousins is actually Gene Wilder. Yeah, that's right. I'm related to Willy fricking Wonka, the good one, not that blasphemous Johnny Depp version. You are also related to Professor Frankenstein. My ancestors have fought in every war the USA has had since the revolution. Also my great-grandfather is in a military museum because the helicopter he flew was shot down and he survived. He kept trying to save people in Vietnam. Also flew Truman around before. Was his name Lieutenant Dan? I only just found out that my great-great-grandmother is the illegitimate child of Queen Emma of the Netherlands she had with the gardener, so that's pretty cool. We still have the bracelet the Queen gave her for her birthday. My dad dated the woman that Jennifer Lawrence's character in American Hustle was based on. One of my maternal ancestors was the first person Bloody Mary executed for Protestantism, causing my family to flee to America in pursuit of religious freedom. On my paternal side, my great-grandfather was a World War II war hero who was given 1/3 of Germany to basically babysit after the war. We have a really beautiful letter from a German professor in that region thanking him for his kindness and decency, and a really badass op-ed he wrote several years later demanding that we give no leniency to Nazis. Maximum punishment for all of them. He also made great strides for US labor groups and was quoted by Roosevelt in a speech. Also same paternal family but way back founded a major US brewery and a crap load of towns and cities along the way. My great-grandfather was part of the resistance in Holland and escaped from a POW camp. One time he knew there were 2 armed Germans in a barn, walked in the door unthinkingly silhouetted by the light, and his gun wasn't loaded. But they surrendered thankfully. He didn't talk about the war to my opa much at all, but that's one of the few stories he told. Great-great-grandfather was the most senior officer to die at Waterloo. There was apparently some frick up with his luggage, and his uniform hadn't arrived, so he had to fight at Waterloo in a bloody suit and top hat. The Duke of Wellington apparently said he was a terrifying man with a furious temper, but there was no man finer for getting a job done. Got shot through the head while leading the charge against a French column. Family folklore says his top hat got blasted off by a cannonball shortly before his death. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a silversmith. He made the inkwell George Washington used to sign the Declaration of Independence. If you've ever been to Independence Hall in Philly, you may have seen it. My great-great-grandfather broke a promise he made to an old gypsy, stole her pig, and is solely responsible for a curse that has plagued my family for 100 years. My great-great-great-uncle was the first man to survive traveling the whole Amazon River. During this expedition, he was shot in the chest with a poison dart. Back then most medical experts would close the wound to try to help it heal, but this would be a death sentence. Because he didn't have the wound closed right away, he survived and lived to be 98. He also discovered several species of birds. Nuck was largely considered a ladies' man of his cave back in 10,001 BC. He wasn't the most handsome, like Crag, or the best hunter, like Dark, but he had a quiet confidence and a large penis that enabled him to impregnate many of the ladies of the cave, and further the advancement of his family line. Long live Nuck. I'm fairly certain that cavemen lived a while before 10,000 BC. The majority of my ancestors were adventurers and often had children abroad, so the family is spread across the globe. My current girlfriend is French and I'm from the UK, so I guess I'm doing them proud. My great-granduncle was an infamous horse thief during and after the Civil War. Less cool is that he did it for the Confederacy. My great-great, etc. Gramps went AWOL on the Confederate side during the Civil War. All these people in here with their Vikings and heroes. Oh well. That he was supposedly kicked out of Ireland for trying to run over a group of nuns with a buggy. My grandpa, everyone. Also, his cousin's dog was in the movie The Quiet Man, our family's claim to fame. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.